Howdy, folks. Mr. McGlashan here for part 3 of our U.S. in World War II lesson. We have to tell the story of the Pacific War now. So let's turn our attention to Imperial Japan. Obviously, the war in the Pacific starts with an ambitious Japan. Japan had been rising as an industrial and military power pretty much since the United States opened it up when Commodore Perry arrived in the shores of Japan in 1854 and sort of forced them open. And Japan embarked upon a crash course of modernization and militarization and industrialization and then colonization. So yeah, the rising sun is the symbol of Japanese shining its greatness across the world like the sun does. And so, folks, yeah, eventually this rising sun conquers a massive empire throughout the Pacific and Asia. This is the height of their empire, actually the very same year that the height of the Nazi Empire in Europe, 1942, was the turnaround year for both. Japan, it is run as a theocracy. The people of Japan were taught to revere their leader, Emperor Hirohito, as a living god. It was feudalistic in that it still has sort of a nobility structure. They say that Emperor Hirohito was actually somewhat of a puppet ruler because behind the scenes it was an oligopoly of the big businessmen and the militarists and the generals that they formed sort of a committee that really ran the country, and they put Hirohito forward as the puppet, but the total devotion of the people he had. Yes, so they were in the early 1910s and 20s a totalitarian dictatorship, firing up their people to conquer the world. They began conquering as early as about 1905, taking some islands around. In 1910, they moved in force into Korea, and soon thereafter began to move into northern China in a region called Manchuria. When they conquered, they came with a slogan that was, supposed to be appealing. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It sounds better in Japanese. Asia for Asians. The idea was that they presented themselves as the alternative to the colonizing Europeans who've been carving up Asia for centuries. They said that we will free you. This is about liberation and cooperation. It did not take long at all for those that were conquered by Japan to realize that these words were hollow. What this was dictatorship and repression. Let's check out this old newsreel.
Astride the white horse of imperial tradition, the 29-year-old ruler of Nippon, Emperor Hirohito, supervises the maneuvers of Japan's military might. Each year since 1884, when Japan modernized her army, all branches demonstrate their efficiency in actual battle practice, under the eye of their royal commander-in-chief and the taxpayers. These troops are typical of the 250,000 soldiers who compose the active forces. The men are between 20 and 23 years of age. In time of war, Japan can increase this army to 1,700,000 men by calling to the colors the 3 reserve classes, Yobi, Kobi, and Kokuman. Every able-bodied male between 17 and 40 puts in 4 years of active service. As a result, Japan is ranked as the leading military power of the East.
All right, so Japan was by far the most industrialized nation in Asia, and it was roaring for conquest. It wanted to catch up with what the Europeans had been doing for hundreds of years. So after somewhat of a pause in 1915, after having only taken Korea and Manchuria, in 1937, they opened a full-scale war against China. It's called the Sino-Japanese War, and yeah, they came in and took Peking. China then set up a provisional capital in Nanking, and later in 1937, they came into Nanking. What happened in Nanking is one of history's most brutal and terrible atrocities. The Japanese army defeated the Chinese army in the outskirts of the city and then were let loose on the civilian population. And yeah, it's said that they killed over 200,000 civilians, many of them executed with samurai swords, and then rapes across the board. The Japanese were even told that they were going to sort of breed the Chinese out. So rape was in fact an imperial policy. The Japanese army committed as bad atrocities there as anywhere. Here's just a little clip of the outskirts of Nanking, and it shows the infamous crying baby shot. that picture is just one of the most impactful pictures I've ever come across. And yeah, this is a scene of a baby amidst the ruin as Japan is rampaging across China. This is 1937, and yes, the world pretty much ignored it. In fact, my grandfather was stationed in China as with the U.S. Marines at the time, and the United States was just told as Japan approached that this is not our war. China was an ally of ours, and we had military bases all over, but no, we are just going to pull back. This is not our war. And so we made way for the Japanese for a while to rampage through. So yeah, the scenes of Nanking are as bad as any. Folks, this video here is a great one. I'm having my students watch this series on the side, so I'm not going to play it, but this gives you the whole story of the Japanese of conquest of Asia and the rape of Nanking in pretty horrific detail. So the world stood by. The League of Nations condemned the Japanese aggression, but were not able to put together any sort of forceful or impactful response. It wasn't until the Japanese invaded French Indochina, which is Vietnam, that the United States finally sort of took notice and began to put some real pressure on Japan. We had been selling them oil and coal and steel and supplying their military effort, but in 1941, Roosevelt cut that off and began an embargo of military supplies to Japan. And that preceded the Pearl Harbor attack, when Japan realized that they were not going to be getting their usual supplies and cooperation from the United States. They kind of figured that there were two great navies in the Pacific, or there's the British as well, so maybe three, but that at one point that the Japanese realized that they were going to have to confront the United States one way or another. And as they contemplated pushing further south, they were going to come across British colonies in Indonesia and other places that were important to the United States. So they thought, hit us quickly in a surprise attack. You know the story. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese sent several aircraft carriers way up north and just out of range of radar. And in a couple waves at about 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning, waves of 400 or so, I forget the numbers, airplanes flew over Pearl Harbor and just unloaded. Americans barely got a response in the air. We actually had set up radar at the time. And in fact, I think we had a radar technician who saw the planes coming, and they just radioed in saying there's something weird on the radio here. And they just said, oh, it must be a training exercise or something, and ignored it. So not much of a defense. The Japanese came and they unloaded. It killed over 2,400 Americans. And of course, this is on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which was not yet a state, but at that point it was a U.S. territory and military base. About 1,200 of the 2,400 that died at Pearl Harbor died on one ship. The USS Arizona got hit so hard its weapon storage blew up, and the ship just went down quick with most of the men in it. That's known as Battleship Row. Kind of famous. Yeah, they did a lot of damage, but they brought us into this war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
All right, you know I love that speech, but we already heard it. All right, you guys. So it wasn't only Pearl Harbor that Japan attacked that day and that week. They actually moved on to the Philippines at the same time. And the U.S. had major military forces and a civilian presence in the Philippines that was significant. And they continued to roll forward. The first year or so that America was in the battle against Japan in the Pacific, we did not do well. There were losses across the board. It was in 1942 when Japan decided to take its next step, and that was the Battle of Midway. Oh yeah, I got to tell this story. Famously, MacArthur, who later leads the reconquest of the Philippines and Japan itself, but when he was stationed in the Philippines in 1941 and the Japanese were overwhelming U.S. forces, as he gets on his PT boat to escape, famously said, "I shall return." And in fact, he did. In 1944, the U.S. reconquered the Philippines from the Japanese. But okay, so Battle of Midway is a turning point. It happens very near the time of Stalingrad, so the turning points in both theaters of war are very similar. Midway is an epic battle. I also have a personal connection there because my grandfather, the same one that evacuated from China, he actually was on Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. And then he was on Midway preparing for its defense and its futile defense because the Japanese were coming with a massive invasion force. And if it wasn't for the heroics of the U.S. Navy that met them in the very center of the Pacific Ocean to try to defend the island, my grandfather probably wouldn't have lived, and I wouldn't be here. So I'm glad that the U.S. had this great victory. Here's kind of a dramatic video
Japan
of it.
strikes
Why
Pearl
not?
Harbor, and America is at war. The aircraft carrier Enterprise leads the U.S. Navy as it strikes back. Now Enterprise is about to face the massive Japanese fleet at Midway. The main force of Japanese ships headed toward Midway include 4 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 150 support ships, 248 carrier aircraft, and some 15 submarines. The American Armada is substantially smaller. 3 aircraft carriers, 50 support ships, 233 carrier aircraft, 127 land-based aircraft on Midway Island, and 8 submarines, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, this is all that is left of America's Navy. The carriers were not present at the sneak attack.
The Japanese realize U.S. Navy aircraft carriers are still out there and are still dangerous. So what we need to do is get rid of their aircraft carriers and then set up one more outpost further out into the Eastern Pacific.
Dawn, June 4th, 1942. USS Enterprise floats near the exact center of the Pacific. A force of 109 Japanese aircraft appear over the atoll. They tear into the American base. 7 a.m. Reports of the attack on Midway reach the Enterprise. The flyers scramble to prepare for their launch. They'll have to fly nearly 2 hours to reach the Japanese ships. The Japanese carriers are hit by bombers.
I aimed at the big red circle at the front.
Enterprise's first attack on the Japanese fleet is breathtaking. The outnumbered flyers of Enterprise have wreaked havoc on the Imperial aircraft carriers.
He could look back and he could see the 3 big balls of fire, and there was the 3 Japanese ships that were on fire.
Now there's only 1 Japanese carrier left, the Hiryu. Just before 11 a.m., Hiryu launches its bombers, a retaliatory strike. The first American carrier that lands in the Hiryu bomber's sights is USS Yorktown. And 3 bombs make direct hits on Yorktown's flight deck. At mid-afternoon, a second wave of bombers arrives from the Hiryu. 2 of the torpedoes score direct hits on Yorktown's port side. The listing deck is a serious problem for Yorktown's flyers. The angle means the Yorktown's aircraft have no place to land. There's only one hope for the stranded flyers of Yorktown, the deck of Enterprise. But there's one more enemy carrier out there. After more than an hour in the air, the dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown come in range of Hiryu. When Fleece dives, it's a direct hit. The bow of Hiryu is torn apart. Fire spreads below decks. The Japanese Navy chooses to sink her. Admiral Yamamoto's plan to trap the American carriers has backfired spectacularly. In a single battle, 4 Japanese carriers are sunk. 1 cruiser is scuttled. 228 Japanese aircraft destroyed, and 3,000 Japanese sailors and crewmen are killed. Although the American losses include 1 destroyer and the carrier Yorktown, it is the most surprising victory in the annals of U.S. naval warfare.
All right, I can't believe I went through that whole thing, but what are you going to do? It's a great battle. All right, folks, so then we have, from 1942 on, it is a tragic story because, you know, Japan was beaten. There was another battle called the Battle of Coral Sea that happened near the time of Midway where they lost another aircraft carrier. U.S. military production is ramping up. Every day that goes by from 42 to 45, it becomes more and more inevitable that the Japanese are going to lose this war, and yet they fight on. And they have islands that are hardened all across the Pacific Ocean with air bases and defenses and thousands of men ready to die for the cause. So the strategy that General MacArthur comes up with is called island hopping, where instead of hitting every single island, you skip past certain islands and then you barricade and blockade them. This is the picture of badass MacArthur coming ashore. Oh, I got it. Sorry. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, island hopping our way from one island to the next to get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Meanwhile, by about 1943, 44, we're able to reach the Japanese mainland with our bombers. and we just began unloading on Japan. The most unbelievably terrible bombing campaigns the world's ever seen were the U.S. Air Force during World War II in Japan. We, and at one point, firebombed Tokyo so badly that 80,000 people died in one single night, even more than the nuclear bombs by some measures. And it was city after city after city. But the Japanese did not surrender, and their men fought everywhere. So you can see the battle lines in the years. By 45, we're right on their doorstep. This is the great Iwo Jima moment that supposedly is somewhat staged, but doesn't matter. It's just an iconic image that shows the Americans taking back an island from Japanese control, one after the other. That was Iwo Jima. So the story of the kamikaze is, of course, as Japan gets even more desperate near the end, they realize that they just have to have every single one of their planes score a direct hit on a U.S. aircraft carrier. And so the kamikaze are... Yeah, there's this old footage that's just incredible, but yeah, they flew ship after ship after ship.
On the other side of the world, there was still a war going on. The Americans were suffering massively in the Pacific. The Japanese had launched suicide kamikaze attacks on the Allied fleet. Though British and other Allied ships were also attacked, it was the Americans who endured the greatest losses. Almost 5,000 were killed, and more than 30 ships of the US fleet were destroyed here off Okinawa in the spring of 1945.
The singing is not necessary, but there's some incredible footage here.
The American aircraft carriers with their wooden decks were particularly vulnerable to the kamikazes. And for many Japanese, the actions of these pilots of the Imperial Air Force were not foolhardy or desperate, but admirable.
All right. That might not have been necessary, but it is an intense aspect of this war. The fact that the Japanese were so stirred up to fight to the bitter end and willing to sacrifice their own lives. On Okinawa, they had some 200,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, and the Americans took like 17 surrenders. It was incredible. They would just keep coming out of the foxholes and keep coming out and just keep dying at U.S. guns. So the unbelievable fanaticism of the Japanese in this period is notable. And so again, it makes you look at the warning signs and all of that. So, all right, in the midst of this, when Japan's defeat seemed inevitable, we have another great power meeting. This time Truman. FDR was there to see Germany surrender, but was not there to see Japan surrender. Another three and a half months went on in the Pacific War after the war in Europe had already ended. But here is Truman, having just taken office, meeting with Churchill and Stalin. All these meetings have these great images of the three representatives. And what they're doing is planning for the eventual defeat of Japan. And they're working out stuff that's going to happen in Europe as well. This is when Truman and Churchill are pushing for Poland to have democratic elections. And Stalin is saying, oh, yes, I'm sure Poland will be a democracy. But as you know, the Soviets bring their style of repression across Eastern Europe. But with respect to Japan, at this point, Stalin agreed to begin the war against Japan. And what else? I forget what else. So, folks, the story behind the story is, of course, the Manhattan Project. As you know, the United States developed the first nuclear bomb during World War II. And as the story goes, Albert Einstein was one of the few people in 1939 who understood that a theoretical nuclear bomb was potentially possible. Nobody knew if it really was. Nobody knew if it would blow up the entire world. But Einstein understood that E equals mc squared in that equation is a recipe for a lot of energy. And Einstein was deeply opposed to his science ever being used for military purposes. And he refused to work on the bomb until in 1939, when Germany's marching over Europe. He famously wrote a letter to FDR. There he is sitting down, smoking his long pipe, and writing a letter that he signed along with some other physicists saying basically, I know these German scientists and I know what they know. And I know that they think that uranium is possible, that it's to be made into a nuclear chain reaction that would create an incredible bomb. And he didn't want to work on it, but he did write the letter saying, FDR, you might want to look into this. FDR was a man of action. And the reason Americans just consistently felt that they had an incredible president during World War II is that he did not dither. He did not say, oh, which solution, what are we going to do? He just did. He did it all. And with this bomb program, he sent resources at it. And he got thousands of scientists and universities, and he commandeered industries, and he kept it top secret, and he went all in. The Germans went all in at one point as well on the bomb, and they got fairly close, but their scientists got close, and then sort of thought, no, I don't think it's going to work. Theoretically, it doesn't seem to work. There were some scientists among them that were sabotaging their effort and stuff. So, but the U.S. stuck with it. As you know, by 1945, Germany had already surrendered, and Japan was left, and our scientists came up with the first prototype, and here it is.
When you look at the actual internal design of a bomb, and it's just so damn clever and neat, and to think that with that you can lift 1 million tons of rock into the sky, it sort of gives you a feeling of omnipotence, which is very seductive.
Arnada del Muerto, The Journey of Death. The men who designed the first atomic bomb race to complete the job. If they're right, this clunky hand-built device will melt desert sand and turn night into day, rendering every previous weapon of war obsolete in a few millionths of a second. The night before Trinity, project scientists, under orders from General Groves, took turns guarding the fully armed, electrically triggered prototype in its metal hut atop the shot tower, as a lightning storm raged around them.
Groves, of course, scurried Oppenheimer away and wouldn't let him get near the tower because he was aware it might go off, and he didn't want to lose his lab director, who would have to get another bomb together for him.
Edward Teller had raised even more frightening concerns. Initial calculations suggested the possibility of triggering an uncontrollable reaction in the atmosphere, one that, in a worst-case scenario, could incinerate the entire world. Hans Bethe was assigned to double-check the math. A decimal point had been misplaced. Odds now favored the world surviving the Trinity test.
That's good.
It must be said to the praise of Edward Teller that he made his group investigate very carefully and make sure that ignition of the atmosphere was totally impossible.
The clouds parted shortly before dawn. Scientists, soldiers, and VIPs moved to their observation posts, some of them more than 20 miles from ground zero. Edward Teller passed out suntan lotion to protect against the ultraviolet radiation. At 5:31 a.m., a mechanical timer in the command bunker clicked at the end of its track. 6 miles away, the firing circuits closed. Capacitors discharged, and 32 critically positioned detonators fired as one. The shockwave from the shaped charges rocketed inward, compressing the plutonium sphere to half its former size and turning it into a superdense liquid before finally crushing the beryllium initiator at its core, releasing a flood of neutrons. The chain reaction developed gradually. More than 80 generations of atomic nuclei had to fission before enough energy was released to crack the bomb casing. The entire process took nearly 8 millionths of a second. It only seemed instantaneous.
The fireball starts out at about 1 million degrees, which means the only radiation coming off of it is X-rays, and you can't see it. It's not producing visible light. And it's only after it cools down, which it does very rapidly, to about 10,000 degrees, the temperature of the surface of the sun, that it suddenly blazes into light. And then, because it's far enough away not to kill you, you just see the explosion. You don't hear the sound. You don't feel the blast. It's just this thing happening in silence. And then abruptly, the sound bursts over your face, and the shockwave blows dust and leaves and sand in your face. And the physical wave is such that it shakes the ground as it goes by you and resonates in your chest cavity.
Well, our first reaction was, we've done it. And it was even more powerful than we had previously calculated. The second thought was, what a horrible gadget have we invented? That was a start.
All right, folks. So what a horrible gadget we have invented. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the head of the entire project, famously said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." All right, folks. We built two after that. That first one was called Trinity. This one was called Fat Man, and this one was called Little Boy. There was some warning given to Japan through leaflets and the demands that they surrender, but those demands had been ongoing. Interestingly, the Japanese had been willing to discuss the possibility of conditional surrender before the nuclear bomb. Their one condition that they were never flexible on was that the emperor would be allowed to live out his life and would not be humiliated. The United States was saying unconditional surrender, unconditional surrender. And, you know, the President Truman is unbelievably was presented with this decision just after becoming president. He didn't even know about it as vice president. That's how secret it was. At least for a while he didn't. But he's briefed on it, and he's told that it'll take about 400,000 soldiers or death. We'd lose 400,000 soldiers to invade Japan traditionally. Or we can try this new bomb that we've invented. And, you know, Truman presented it as if it was never a decision. It was never a tough decision for him. It, of course, looking back, is one of history's most unbelievable decisions, because the decision by one person to entirely incinerate two cities, killing 200,000 people in an instant, is certainly a decision. You know, it's a great debate to discuss what you would have done if you were in Truman's shoes. When you attack the beaches, you, of course, kill combatants mostly. When you attack cities, you kill civilians. At the beginning of this war, we were absolutely opposed to killing civilians. The United States entered and said we would never firebomb cities and we would never target civilian populations. In fact, when Hitler did that in 1936 in Spain, and then when he did it blitzkrieging across Europe, it was just a shock to most people, because why would you bomb cities with schools and libraries? How does that help you militarily? It was just, it didn't make sense. But the idea that you bomb to break the nation itself became more and more common. I mean, yes, the British got into it against the Germans, and then the US gave up their reservations as well, and began to do it. And this is the quintessential moment when we make a decision to incinerate two cities. So we have Hiroshima. The numbers are a huge range because people died instantly and people died slowly. Many Americans who then occupied Japan and walked through these areas died because of radiation. Very little was known about radiation at the time. So huge variance. Nagasaki was the second city. If you're asking me, I've always understood Truman's decision to use the bomb once. I always thought, why not try it in a less populated area to see if demonstrating its power would do. But even if you do on one city, why the second city? 3 days later, August 6th, Hiroshima, August 9th, we drop it on another city and another 40 to 80,000 people are killed. It is, I guess, a fitting end to the most terrible war in all of history. Japan surrendered with their one condition. They still held the condition that their emperor live out his life, and he did. Emperor Hirohito lived to the 70s. So that's something. Like, could we have actually gotten the same deal? But it was an absolute surrender. The United States occupied Japan. MacArthur became essentially a military ruler of Japan for a number of years, and obviously fairly successfully built Japan up into a modern democracy. The celebrations, this is my favorite. 1945, Times Square, celebrating that now both the European and the Pacific War are done. I love this one because this is a Chinese American. in New York celebrating the end of Japan. As you can imagine, they felt that personally. There they are. Good style in the 40s. Look at those jeans. Nice wingtips. Folks, this is the most terrible war in all of history, as we know. The losses in the Soviet Union are mind-boggling. They're just so far beyond what everybody else lost. This chart is, interesting. You look at the blue line, that is the percentage of the nation's population that perished. So about 12, 13% of the people in the Soviet Union died in that war. But you see that's not even the highest. You take a place like Poland. And Poland has, what is that, about 18% of their population died. And that's, of course, mostly in that young age group. Lithuania, I mean, this is mind-boggling. So U.S. losses were significant, over 400,000 soldiers, but obviously nothing like what these other countries suffered. The bombing I referred to in Japan was also done on Germany. The United States killed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Germans in just terrible, terrible bombing raids. They called them the 1,000-plane raids because we would send 1,000 planes over Germany and would just unload 10,000 pounds of bombs each on Bremen and Hamburg and Berlin itself. Guys, the Holocaust, when all the dust settled, oh God. And so you look here at what the Holocaust did to the Jewish populations of Europe. And, Germany, 90% of the Jewish people in Germany were killed. Poland, 90% of the Jewish people in Poland. Lithuania. I mean, so keep in mind, it was not only the Germans that committed the Holocaust. There were so many of the local populations in the areas that they colonized or conquered were complicit and participated, and even in some cases led the pogroms and the attacks against the Jews. So obviously, the Nazis deserve the most blame. So yeah, it's history's saddest episode. So can we find hope in our current situation with the coronavirus, that humans have bounced back? Humans have bounced back, folks. I'm going to end with this picture here. This is a group of Jewish people in a Nazi concentration camp that were liberated, given some champagne. Imagine the pain that they had been through, and yet look at them. The human spirit lives on. It manages somehow. Somehow, how can they be smiling with what they've just been through? But there they are. So it's a terrible war. It's a great war. Thanks for tuning in, folks.